Miigwech, Bushuginawa, Miigwech Biajai Gnungum, Giganos Indigenous, Nayashi Winningaming and Donjaba, Nigigin Dodem. I'm grateful for the opportunity that I've been given to come and speak with you today, and I want to develop this idea of learning from the land. And this is a product of many years of work, including time with my parents and grandparents and children. And so what I want to develop with you today is some of the ways that I'm thinking about law as they're drawn out from relationships and as they're drawn out from the earth. The kinds of things I want to point out are that our law has many different sources as Anishinaabe people, and Indigenous peoples generally can make that claim. Our laws are sourced in our sacred understandings of the world. We find them through analogies to the environment. Our laws come from the way we talk with one another in terms of our deliberation and our persuasion. Laws are also founded in kind of the positivistic proclamations and declarations that are generated from time to time, the do's and don'ts of the world. And then our laws are customary, the way we behave, the implicit actions that we find as we're engaged through time. And then our laws also flow through relationships like treaties, etc. So there are many choices that we have as Indigenous peoples when we make law, just as is the case when we think about law more generally. It's not an automatic activity. Law is very much a human activity, and so that's what I want to explain today, is how the larger world around us can come into the human world. And in particular, I'm just going to be showing pictures of the reserve, which is Nayashi Winningaming, the Cape Croker Indian Reserve, about 4 hours north of Toronto on the Saugeen or the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, north of Owen Sound and Wyerton. And for Anishinaabe people, we find that these laws are literally written in the earth. So you know the word maybe for teaching in Anishinaabe is Kikinomagewin. The word for drawing out law is Ekinomagewin, at least one of those words. The word for earth is Eki. Nomage is to point towards and take direction from. So when you think about Ekinomagewin, the point is that you look to the earth, you see what's happening there, and then you reason by way of analogy in relationship to, how the birds are acting, waters, clouds, rivers, rocks, all the kinds of things that you see when you're in that kind of an environment. This is a picture just outside of our home on the reserve at Cape Croker, and you'll see the Limestone Escarpment in the background. This area is a part of a 440 million year history when Ontario used to be at the equator. And it was a shallow sea, and it was much like the Great Barrier Reef, as it were. And so you had all this sea life that was growing in that space. So when you walk along the shores of the reserve, or when you look to the escarpment, you find the life of that once upon a time is a life that continues to show itself to us as you pick up rocks and you see these beautiful fossils all over the place. That is a reminder that we are very much latecomers as Anishinaabe people to a broader set of relationships. So when I was learning about law, Anishinaabe law from Basil Johnson, one of our elders who just lived around the point here, he would help to encourage me to see law as in the very kind of world around us. This idea again that law is found in place. He would point me to the little ants and grasshoppers and robins, etc., and say, if you learn from them, you will learn what we should be doing as Anishinaabe people. So I'm just going to read a quote that he wrote in one of his 18 books. Learning comes not only from books, but from the earth and from our surroundings as well. Indeed, learning from the mountains, valleys, forests, meadows preceded book knowledge. What our people know about life and learning, good and evil, laws and the purposes of insects, birds, animals, and fish comes from the earth, the weather, the seasons, the plants, and other beings. He says the earth is our book, the day its pages, the seasons, paragraphs, the years, chapters. The earth is a book alive with events that occur over and over for our benefit. Mother Earth has formed our beliefs, attitudes, insights, outlooks, values, and institutions. So what Basil was teaching here is that our archive of legal knowledge is literally the earth, and a literacy is associated with reading this book. And this literacy comes through Anishinaabe, and so I'm not fluent, but the little bit that I know, and I've been working on it for 10 years, we have a language table at UVic. The little bit I know helps me understand that the morphemes of sound are related to the very ecology itself. And that sense of literacy that comes through the language that then points you to stories that are found in this place is, again, an opportunity to reason by way of analogy. What you often find when you look at our world is the sense of layering and reflection and patterns that is a part of those legal traditions. We find in Anishinaabe that the literacy is actually related to the animacy of the earth as well. So this is just one of those overhanging cliffs on the escarpment. Not surprisingly, we call that Chief Rock. And it reminds us that when we speak Anishinaabe, so much of the language is to describe the world as living, not just as a philosophical conception, but actually in the language itself. That's the way that you would, like, in French and English, you learn between what's animate and masculine and feminine. In Anishinaabe, when you would learn about the animacy and the inanimacy of the world around us. So it's not only that once upon a time these were living 440 million years ago, but it's the fact that they're living today. And part of our challenge as Anishinaabe people in creating law in the present day is to listen to this living earth and to understand what it's telling us. And again, that messages, they come in so many different ways, through the language, through the stories, through the experience directly on the land. So one of the things that we've been doing as we think about Anishinaabe, a king in this area, is trying to situate learning in the precise sites. This is the Bruce Peninsula I was telling you about. Here's what it looks like in the air. Our stories of where we came from talk about us coming out of the water with the divers and the great turtle. And so over the past 4 years on the reserve, we've been having students come from different law schools to learn about Anishinaabe law on the land in this methodology that I'm describing to you. And so the first day, we talked to them about water and how there's so much law that flows from the water and the stories of connection in relationship to the water. And I know M.A. Kraft is back here. She does a lot of water law teachings and the work that she's involved with and has a water law camp in this part of the world as well. But for those students, as they learn about the water and our stories from the water, they start to see not only should we be protecting the water, but in fact, the water itself is measurement, standards, criteria, authority, precedent for making judgments in the world. I think that what's important about this is that as you understand the stories as they're related to the water, you then start to see why the Anishinaabe women are engaged in water walking throughout the Great Lakes and beyond, why the responsibilities of women in relationship to the water are so powerful, not only in itself because we value the water intrinsically, which we greatly do, but also because the water is a part of our human community and is a part of the community of how we would counsel together is trying to listen to the water, as it were. Now, this sounds all very abstract until you think about maybe some of the ways we talk about water. I had a colleague who was a student of mine. Her name is Danica Littlechild. She's a Cree woman. She wrote her LLM with me. She's currently the president of UNESCO. Let me tell you how she talked about this. She says, Nipe is the Cree word for water. Ni derives from nia, meaning I or I am. Pi derives from the word pimatsuin, meaning life. Nipe, thus, is properly understood as meaning I am life. Right, so in the language there, you get this description of what this being is, the sense of life itself, of course, which we know we all come from. She goes on, water is lifeblood, animating us as human beings and all that is around us. The Cree language operates on the principle of anima, life force. Understanding that elements of ourselves and our environments have an inner life force determines how those elements are described, usually in a relational manner. Water is as much a process as an entity, and it has so many identities in our language. She says over 40 words or phrases in Cree describe water in all its forms and manifestations. It's a living cultural and spiritual identity that defies reduction to a mere resource. And so you probably are familiar with what's been happening in different parts of the world as there has been a recognition of rivers as being agents, their own forces that have personality and law, and therefore, for instance, with the Wanganui River in New Zealand, if that river is going to be used, interacted with in an official manner, there's this whole organizational structure that's now set up in accordance with both Maori law, tikanga, and Crown law to involve the water and talk to the water and listen to the water when making decisions in that setting. And you might think, how can we do that? Again, that sounds so abstract. Well, it's the language, it's the stories, it's the elders, it's the teachings that people have about how that water is living that equips you to be able to listen to that river. And then, of course, science and other tools are also important to appreciate and discern what the health, what the voice, what that life force is saying in terms of how it needs to be treated in that space. Now, to bring that a little bit more concretely, this is a poor analogy, but nevertheless an analogy that sometimes helps people understand. If you think about corporations, corporations in the laws around the world, in Canadian law, are persons. They're artificial persons that are given life by statute. So how do we hear this artificial person? Well, you set up a board of directors that tries to understand what the purposes of the corporation are and what the long-term vision could be. And then from that, you hire officers, CEOs, CFOs, to be able to do the day-to-day management of that body. And then there's rules in place to prevent the managers from taking advantage of their own position, fiduciary laws and trust laws, things that deal with conflict of interest, such that those that are involved in the corporation have kind of this checks and balances in the way that they operate. And then there's the shareholders, which are also joined to this. In other words, we have ways of working with artificial beings in this world that have huge power. So much of our life is governed by corporations and the way that they operate in the world, and they're not really even there in some sense. And of course, water is there, and there are ways of not organizing corporations. I'm not suggesting that for a moment, but organizing our ability to talk with one another, figure out what's the longer term view, what's the contemporary day-to-day relationships, and then how the water relates to the other beings that are surrounding it. So this idea, akinomagewin, right, taking from what's around us, in this case, nibit-anagewin, taking from what's around us, and then making analogies to our present activities. I thought this picture was interesting because it kind of foreshadows that turtle coming out of the water upon which so much of Anishinaabe stories depend. I don't have enough time to tell you this, but if you were to come to Cape Croker, we would spend 5-6 hours just on this one story alone, appreciating the legal processes of Anishinaabe people that flow from the counseling process that was related to this diver story, the time when the earth was all full of water. And then we have not just procedures, but then substantive principles that also flow from these occasions. And so we've had students from Osgoode Hall Law School, University of Toronto Law School. Last year, McGill law students came to be with us. This coming weekend, I'm going to Walpole Island First Nation, just north of Windsor, with the University of Windsor law students who are taking a 4-day course with Val Wabos, one of the Anishinaabe law professors that's associated with that school. We've also done this work with the Chippewa of the Thames, Deshkanzi being south of London, Ontario, where students from that school get to participate in this process. So there's something that can be done when you take students onto the land that helps us understand, again, what are the criteria by which we live? What are the sources of authority, the measurements, the guideposts, the standards, the precedents, etc. We find in that then so many ways to teach about our responsibilities. Here's a picture of a turtle, and you can see on the back the 13 plates that form its back. Anishinaabe people have so much to say about this again. Each of those plates represents a different moon for the Anishinaabe. We're coming out of Onabani-Gizis in our part of the world into Iskega-Mizige-Gizis. So we're coming out of the hard crust on the snow moon into the sugar moon. And each of the moons has reference to some kind of ecological fact that's happening on the earth at the time. So Odea Minigizis, the strawberry moon, or Menominike Gizis, the ricing moon, or Watebaga Gizis, the changing color moon. In other words, here's a little book, right? And on the back of this book are these memory devices that when you see a turtle swimming through the water, you're seeing a little case swim through the water. You're seeing principles there at your feet in that water that are teaching you, again, procedurally how you might live with one another, and then substantively how you might live with one another. Again, it all sounds very abstract in this room, but if we were on the land and we had time to develop the stories, it's that methodology of trying to think about. Analogies don't just come from how a judge might have reasoned in a past case when there was a dispute around a similar issue, and then how this present situation might correlate to that past case. But there's, of course, other ways of drawing analogies out. Nigigan Dodem. I'm the Otter clan. This is my Dodem. When my great-great-grandfather entered into a treaty dealing with 1.5 million acres of land in Ontario, he put his little otter signature on that treaty document. Our traditional territory goes from what's now Goderich on the shores of Lake Huron to Arthur in the middle of Ontario, up to Collingwood and everything north. When we signed that treaty, we were inviting people to live in accordance with the law that we knew in that place, the law that we learned from our clans, the law that our family learned from the otter, the law that other families learned from the bear and the loon and the beaver and the pike, etc. So the invitation to treaties, the invitation that was given to settlers that were coming to live amongst us, was to learn about this counseling process that was a part of the formation of our people, that was taken into our community through the teachings that we have with these different animals, so that when we live in that place, we live like the otters and the bears and the birds, etc. Again, it sounds very abstract, but you can get quite detailed, because I could tell you story after story after story about how these animals behave as they interact with one another, or as they interact with our trickster figure, Nana Bojo or Nana Bush, and they find places of, again, guidance for decision making, resolving disputes, regulating community behavior. So there's so much that is a part of this set of laws amongst the Anishinaabe. And of course, if our land starts to hurt, if we find that the water is polluted, or we're getting a decrease in the way that that water is interacting on our territory, or if there's forests that are cut down, or mining that's put in, or animals start to disappear, what our problem is not only do we lose the intrinsic value of these things on their very own setting, but it's like taking away volumes of books from the library. It's like cutting us off from the possibilities of reasoning from those animals, water, plants, rocks, as we see them before us. Here's a little rabbit, Wabozo. So we go from water to rocks, to plants, to insects, to birds, to animals, as we go through the 4 days together. And as we're doing this, we're talking about our constitution as Anishinaabe people, not necessarily our noun of constitution, but our verb. How are we constituted? How are we constituting? And the notion, when I first learned constitutional law from Basil Johnson, he would spend hours and hours and hours just talking about the rabbit and how it's related to Wabozo, Nanabojo, the rabbit stealing fire. The rabbit is sometimes Nanabojo that's there at the beginning of the water stories. There's again so much to see as they dance through the earth in their cycles. We can also look to the sky. So when the sun goes down and we're standing on the land with these students and we look up and suddenly our stories are present there because they're in the constellations. The story of Ojiganang and Manganang and Mododoswan Anang. These are part of what we observe on the earth, but we also see, because they're in the sky, that we can reference our territory no matter where we stand in the Northern Hemisphere. So sometimes I feel homesick when I'm at the University of Victoria, as beautiful as that is, but when the sun goes down and I look up, I recognize there's my territory. Right? There's all of the stories that we talk about as we are looking at the earth that are reflected in the sky. And thinking about the law in that fashion, Basil would tell me that the sky is our home and that children are gifts from the stars. And so you can start to think about how the law would cherish and value children if they come to us in this fashion. And so some of the things that have been done through residential school or child and family services are a breach of that law if we don't treat our children as these gifts that come from the sky and will one day return to the sky. This notion that when we pass, we go along the path of the souls leading to the land of the dead, Chibai Mikana, or Benesi Mikana. That there's so many teachings about what's necessary to live a good life here that enables you to live a good life there. This little Ode Amin, this little strawberry, as we call it, is a figure that also was a person that walked on that road and came back from that road to tell us how to live in accordance with our 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings. Anyways, it's to make the point that it's not just in the water, it's not just in the physicality of what's on this plane, it's also in another plane that you can reference. A couple of months ago when I've been on sabbatical this year at McGill University, in November, the students get out once a month with a pop-up telescope. They want to get away from the stress of classes. They just want to spend some time with one another. And so they go to a certain part of the city and they just set up a telescope and they talk with one another about what they see. And then they hope people stop along the way just to visit with them as that's going on, so they increase their circle of friends. Well, they invited me to do this, and we went up to the top of Mount Royal, which is the back of the turtle. And we were on the back of the turtle, and they set their telescope up, and we, for hours and hours, were able to talk about how principles for behaving, that is law, Chinakanagewan is another word for law, the great guided way of decision-making is found in these places. So law comes from a Kinomagawan, pointing to the earth and taking direction from the earth. Law comes from Chinakanagewan, the guided ways of decision-making. Law is also in the Ijatwawanan, the behaviors that we have with one another. It's also the Manidu Enakinagewan, the law that comes from the spirits, or the law that comes from this other realm as well, that then has to be taken into human community. We disagree with one another about what that law might require or say, and so in talking with one another, we can sort out what the possibilities are for action in those moments. This is, of course, a picture of that road that I was talking about earlier that we can learn so much for. This is a picture of the clouds that I thought was really interesting, again, just outside of our home, because I see patterns in that picture, patterns of the thunderbirds, the Anamiki Ka, and how they help us understand some of the ways that we can be behaving. anyways, this is something that we're going to do now for more than 4 days with law students, because last month, maybe even this month, we received approval from the British Columbia government to be able to fund a program that will be a joint degree in Indigenous law and the common law. So beginning September, students can come to UVic, and over 4 years you can get 2 degrees. One of those degrees, which will qualify you when you graduate to be able to article and then sit the bar and be practicing in any of the provinces that recognize that degree, which is all the provinces. And then also, though, you would get a JID, which is a Juris Indigenous doctorate. And so you would come to my class, and we would have a course in Constitutionalism, and through 8 months, I would be telling you these stories at length. I would organize them in accordance with linguistic insights, and I would then look to how Anishinaabe people are passing constitutions, both in Canada and the United States, because our tradition extends into North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So we would look at what's going on with constitutions down there. We would understand the regulation and the legislation that's a part of our world in that fashion. We would look at the tribal court judgments, which are very constitutionally oriented in the United States around citizenship and voting and governance, etc. But I'd always try to keep that written tradition in the context of this oral tradition. And as I would be teaching that, I'd also be teaching federalism and Aboriginal and treaty rights and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, so that once you got through that first year of constitutional law, you'll have learned what you need to know as a constitutional law student from a Western perspective, but because we're always engaging in comparison and contrast, you'll have a beginning of an understanding of Anishinaabe constitutionalism. But then you'll walk out of my class and you'll go into my colleague Val Napoleon's class, and she'll teach a class about land. So she'll give, in some ways, what you would get in understanding property law from a Western legal system, but because she'll be teaching Gitxsan law, she'll help the students understand about how those people relate to land and how their sense of property, as it were, is formed by things that we do at these camps that they do in their place. They sing their law. I'll be singing law with a drum in these courses sometimes. She'll be singing law. They have masks that are a part of how they represent their legal world. And they also have these beautiful button blankets that indicate the different clans that are part of their legal universe. And so you would then go on from that to a Hulkaminam class, where you would learn about the laws of involuntary obligation amongst the Salish people on Vancouver Island. How do they organize things to take care of one another? What are their duties of care? And of course, in Western law, we have duties of care. They're called laws of negligence and nuisance, etc. So we would do this over a year and a half, and the students would get the common law, but also the Indigenous legal perspectives from different national or First Nations points of view. But in that 4-year process, students will get 2 4-month-long field schools working with communities on site with their laws and using their laws to try to address the questions that they have. So our first group of 25 students is coming into the school beginning of September, and a little advertisement, we're still open for students who want to apply. The June LSAT can be written as a part of that purpose. But even before the students in the 4-year program get to go onto the field schools, we're offering our first semester-long field school this coming September for students who are already in the JD program, and it's going to be a Wisanich Law Field School. This is the people that just live north of Victoria. There's 4 reserves north of Victoria on the Saanich Peninsula, and I'll be teaching the course with Rob Clifford, who's Wisanich himself. He graduated from UVic. He did his LLM at UVic. He's a doctoral student that's at the end of his time at Osgoode Hall Law School. He's going to be the teacher there. And for the first 3 weeks, what we're going to be doing is going on the land again and learning from those lawkeepers, elders, people like Robert, what is the law in those places. So we'll be on the tops of some of the mountains there where they were holding on at the time of a flood, and they had their canoes tied in that place. We'll be in the river mouths, talking about their practices of cleansing. We'll be on the shores. We're going over to the Gulf Islands to see where some of their traditional villages were in that site, and be told about the legal relationships that they have with that territory for 3 weeks. And then we'll have 16 students in the class, and they'll work in groups of 2 for 7 weeks on a particular issue that's of concern to the community that they are hoping that they can apply Wisanich law to. And so one of the projects will be on Pender Island. There's an old village site that's also subject to development as resorts and cottages are being put there. And some of the things in that village site have been taken and put into universities, some of the artifacts and human remains in universities, in other places. And so their question is, what would Salish law, what would Wisanich law do there to help to deal with that disturbance of that historic site? 2 other students will work with Child and Family Services. What will Wisanich law do to help bring in a better way of dealing with guardianship and adoption and all the things that are associated with that system? Their reserves are between the ferry and the airport in Victoria, and there's often a lot of traffic that goes up and down the highway between those 2 places, and so there's commercial opportunities that they're not taking advantage of. But they want to make sure that they proceed with commercial development in accordance with Wisanich legal principles. And so 2 students will get to work on the healthy economy of that territory and what that would look like. It goes on like this. My favorite project is in grade 11, Wisanich students, as all students in British Columbia, are required to take a law course. And right now that law course is by and large a kind of social science of Canadian law. Nothing wrong with that, but they want to develop a Wisanich law course to develop and give that to all the students that come through that school. And so I can imagine what a great project that would be, working with teachers, working with elders and lawkeepers to say how that could be brought to the younger generation and can be used to look at, again, standards, criteria, authority, precedent, procedures, principles to regulate behavior and to be able to resolve disputes. After that experience, the students would then come back to the larger group again, and they would get to learn vicariously from one another as reports would be made about what it was that you did during that time when you were working on the village sites and the intellectual and cultural property, or with the Child and Family Services area, putting together the curriculum for the school. So there's peer-to-peer learning that would occur in that process. The community is going to get memos that they could use if they so choose, that are, again, trans-systemic, thinking about Canadian law, but largely Wisanich law on that site. Students will write an academic paper, and as they do this twice before they graduate in 2 different field schools, you can see they'll start to get an understanding about what it would be like to practice law, actually Indigenous peoples' law, in ways that are consistent with those traditions and in accordance with those protocols. And our hope isn't just that we produce excellent people who are able to serve these communities as they work off into the future if they're so called upon, but we also view this as a process of the resurgence of the common law as well. That is, we think that people could be better trained in the common law as a result of learning this in a comparative way, because they'll see the common law itself as a cultural system. And as a cultural system, there's choices that are made all along the way when you pass legislation or you engage in constitutional debate or you pick up contracts toward our property. And by being aware of where the sort of the decision points are in that system, that I hope will give those students some tools to be able to be more mindful of the practice in that site as well. There's a statement I often make that a fish doesn't know about water until the first time it jumps into the air. Right? It's the contrast of being in another element that suddenly makes you aware of what otherwise feels familiar. Well, right now our students are by and large just swimming in the common law. And it feels like it's natural and it's normal and it's neutral and it's kind of acultural. It doesn't have that kind of content to it. But our students are going to be jumping in and out of the water, into the air, back and forth the whole time. And that sort of taking that change, I think, will do something to not only benefit us as Indigenous peoples in relationship to our own laws, but I'm hoping there's a piece of this too, which can be beneficial more generally. So as we think about our law being drawn out from the earth and ways that people can be introduced to the beauty that surrounds us, I think that's a real opportunity, a real moment that we're living in as this generation that's here all of these ages later, to be able to introduce people into the treaty relationship. Right? To say, what did it mean when my grandpa did that? This is my great-great-grandpa here, the one that entered into that treaty relationship. What did he mean? And what happened then as this was passed down? My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my mother, myself, my sister, my daughter. There's ways that as we come through the 7 generations that we can see that these laws can be drawn out, they can be recorded, and they can be put into our hearts and our minds and made living legal traditions. Miigwech bizinduig mi'u ahau. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you.